Greetings, and today there's a short little video about a equally short early concept game called Fatekeeper. Before I go into specific detail, there's a few disclaimers that I have to make about the game. The most important one is if you have very bad motion sickness, the best idea might be to only listen to the video, because in its current form the game seems to have some sort of screen shake or camera issues. I can't even really point at what it is. I tried to turn off every type of head bobbing and camera shake in the game and it still feels weird. I personally don't experience a lot of motion sickness in video games generally, but in this game even I felt a little bit weird playing this after a while, and I don't know, I hope this gets solved in a future update, because it's a little bit taxing on your head playing this game for a longer time. Now, the second disclaimer is that currently there isn't a lot of time that you would play this game, because it is about 3 hours long. That is if you are not very well accustomed with Vermintide-ish combat and generic Souls-like games. If you're even a little bit more skilled at these games and you have better luck with the bosses in this game, you might be done with the game in under 2 hours, which is very dangerous for the developer, because that means you can finish the game and refund it. But also, and that is the last disclaimer, the game is only $6 or $8, kind of depending on your specific region and your currency. So that means it's very cheap, but it's also very short, and honestly it needs a little bit of work in certain areas. So let's just get straight into the main review. Firstly, we already talked about the price, $6 to $8. Is that something you should worry about if it's only 2 hours of content? Well, it's an early access game, and I would argue it is the earliest of access possible. We're almost talking about like an alpha state. Usually when you talk about early access games, you expect there to be maybe 30%, 40%. That's kind of in a rough state, but it's completed. In this case, when you look at the maps, the levels, the gameplay and the story aspects that have been finished so far, the only thing that this game consists of currently is the hub area, the beginning level, which is more of a tutorial, and kind of the proper first level. That's basically it. So when I say this game is in a very early access state, I do mean it. That's maybe also the reason why it's only $6 to $8. Now, I don't know how long the final release is planned to be. I heard it was 7 to 8 hours maybe, and there is a few things that are teased in the trailer, like different NPCs you can talk to. These are not present in the game currently, so maybe you end up with a 6 to 8 hour game costing you $6 to $8. I'm assuming the price is not going to change. So I guess if you don't want to buy it now, wait for full release and see if it's still $6 to $8. At this price point, there really isn't anything negative to say about the game, besides, it's not being finished and being in a very early state. I don't really know if this game is supposed to be a proof of concept to prepare for a true product, or if this is actually supposedly turning into a fully fledged game, because again, the price is very low. Now, performance-wise, it runs on Unreal Engine 5 and it looks like an Unreal Engine 5 title. It does evoke a little bit of that Vermintide feeling. It does not quite have the visual design. I assume if they made it too much like a 40k game, they would have ended up gotten sued by Games Workshop anyway. But some of the beginning levels, they feel like you're in like a dwarven fortress or something like this. I don't know where the assets are coming from in this game. Maybe they're store-bought assets, maybe they have been created on their own, no real idea. It kind of does look a little bit like one of your run-of-the-mill Unreal Engine titles. It looks nice. It does have that fantasy aspect to it, but it's also Unreal Engine assets, obviously. The game currently starts you off in the beginning hub or tutorial area, and there you see a rat, and if I said this was a Vermintide and then I tell you that you can't kill the rat, then some people are probably very disappointed now. But yes, unfortunately in the Vermintide-like game you can't kill the rat. Rat is friend in this game, but you can however throw the rat into the abyss. That's something you can do. Gameplay wise, it feels like a deliberately weightier and slower version of classic Vermintide combat. However, I think the current button layout and some of the button designations need some work. You can rebind them, That's very important. You can rebind them, but at the moment as it stands right now, you use your left click for light attacks and your right click for heavy attacks. Instead of the game using a charged attack system like Vermintide, there's dedicated heavy and light attack buttons, which also means that the block button is not on the right click, which might be a little bit confusing to someone who's mostly played Vermintide and Darktide games. I would have really liked there to be a default button setup where heavy and light attacks were on the left click depending on how you press the button, and then the block is on the right click, because it just feels a little bit more natural than pressing R. I also don't know how this game plays on a controller at all. That is something I probably should say at this point in time. I have not played with a controller. I don't know how good this game performs when you use that input method. On mouse and keyboard, it's fine. Now, besides blocking, heavy attacking and normal attacking, you also have a kick and a basic jump. The kick is fairly useful against shield-hugging enemies. There's other tools that are useful against that, but this is just for the basic movement system. You can kick enemies off of ledges. The game has an interesting ragdoll system. I feel like some of the enemies should have a little bit more weight to them. Currently, they feel like they're a little bit light when you kick them. At least they go flying everywhere, depending on how you kick them. And the kick itself feels also a tiny bit clunky. Then you have a basic jump in the game. Something you shouldn't underestimate, by the way. The jump gets you up ledges really far. You can climb up certain stuff in the game that you wouldn't expect to be climbable. And you will make jumps in the game that look like you can't make them. So judging your jump distance and then figuring out where you can and can't go in this game is a little bit tricky, because it doesn't look like you can jump up something and it doesn't look like you can jump far enough, but then the character kind of clips onto the edge and mantles. So you can indeed make that jump. It's very early in development, you know, it's probably going to get a little bit more polish, but yes, you have a jump that is much more effective and much more useful than you think it is. The game revolves a lot around blocking and dodging. I would argue that the block is almost more useful than the dodge in certain areas. Blocking effectively is more useful with larger and heavier weapons, and you pay a little bit more stamina when you block with lighter weapons. I also think that sometimes damage seems to come through your block when you block with small weapons, but that might be a hitbox or a bug that's kind of not behaving correctly. Blocking is usually fully guarding against damage, which is good, because blocking also acts as a little bit of a parry. It feels like there's a perfect block in the game where enemies recoil more, but it also depends on which weapon you are using. Obviously, if you have a dinky little dagger, blocking with a dagger, the enemies won't recoil as much as when they're hitting a solid, gigantic mace that you're wielding. Certain weapons have different block attacks where you immediately can kind of do a little bit of a bonk from a blocking perspective. From the blocking position, you can immediately attack an enemy. These attacks felt a little bit short range, and I think I never hit anyone with a block attack, but you can do it. And besides this, you have a generic dodge ability, which has no iframes. That's something you need to kind of keep in mind. At least I think there are no iframes. So you do need to actually dodge an enemy's attack the moment it would literally hit you. If you perfect dodge an enemy, you get like a slowdown effect, and that gives you a little bit more of a damage window. And depending on which type of weapon you're using, the weapons have a certain type of follow through and stagger. So bigger weapons stagger enemies quickly and more severely. In terms of staggering, they're actually ragdoll enemies when you hit them. And that also depends on whether or not you're doing a heavy attack, obviously. Smaller weapons like the dagger doesn't do a good job staggering enemies. Combat in the game feels like it is a little bit more Dark Souls 2 inspired, and I usually like slow and deliberate combat. It just feels a little bit clunky in this game, and I think that is usually due to very deliberate hitbox issues and some of the weird movements that the enemies can do, and there are definitely bugs in this game. I experienced 2 specific input related issues where after a block attack, my character would refuse to attack himself. So he would just stand there, block, Then you would click the attack button, the character wouldn't attack, and you would end up getting hit. Then there's a few very obvious hitbox and hit detection issues where your weapon just goes through enemies. It's just the generic issues that a game like this would probably have. Attacks that shouldn't go as far actually go way further than they look like, while other attacks have a weirdly small hitbox. Stuff like this. It's very obvious that an early access game would have issues like that. In addition to the melee system, as I was alluding to, there is a very basic magic system. You have different elemental spells, basically fire, ice, stuff like this. You can freeze an enemy and you can set enemies on fire. There is poison, fire, ice effects in the game, and some of them you can put on your weapon. And then there are two different versions of a telekinetic push and pull ability, basically force push and force pull. These are very useful in order to get rid of enemies if you want to push them off a ledge or pull them off of a ledge. However, some of the larger enemies in the game will resist that, so you can't just pull them or pull their weapons off. Enemies that have dropped their weapons, you can obviously yank them off with the telekinesis and then throw a spear that you snagged from an enemy. And most importantly, the telekinesis can interact with environmental aspects such as buttons, which is very important to open some of the gates. In addition to that, telekinesis, both of these abilities can get rid of shield-hugging enemies at range, which is pretty useful. Smaller enemies can kind of freely be pulled and pushed because they seem to have almost no form of inherent poise. Then there are mid-sized enemies. They only really get staggered a little bit, but they will not be significantly affected by this. And then most of the bosses seem at least somewhat immune to the telekinesis effect. The map offers plenty of spikes, traps and holes that you can utilize. So using telekinesis and pushing and pulling enemies, even if you're not built into magic, is generally a good idea, because with how many environmental hazards there are in the game, it's easy to kill enemies. I mean, you can just kick them into it too if you don't want to use the magic system. One thing you need to take into account here is the magic system as well as the stamina and health system are built upon a crafting system. That means that magic resources, mana and health resources cannot be recouped through an Estus flask. There is no Estus flask in this game, and that is a little bit of a problem. What you essentially have here is, if you played Mortal Shell 1, you were basically gathering mushrooms in that game in order to heal yourself. That is the same thing that happens in this game, only there are different types of gathering and crafting materials. There are things that heal you, there are things that cause damage. That is what you would use to build a type of bomb. There is basically an alchemy table that you can use to generate and cook stuff. There are tinctures that you can put on your weapon, so you're basically putting dirty shit onto your weapon that you found somewhere in a field, and that gives it poison effect. You can basically mix and match different tinctures and elixirs together. I mean, you could theoretically make a mixture that just damages yourself if you want to do that, but essentially you will be gathering mana or health regenerating items, making a potion, and then you will consume that potion in order to get your resources back. So mana unfortunately does not regenerate, so does health. And there is no dedicated Estus flask. That is a bit of a problem because the game currently doesn't have a classic Dark Souls checkpoint system, meaning when you sit down at a checkpoint or when you unlock a literal bonfire, it doesn't regenerate your resources and it doesn't respawn any enemies. Yes, this game has no respawning enemies, no respawning crafting materials, and the checkpoints are literal save points. Now, you probably already suspect that this can lead to some issues. Let's say you are in front of a boss room and you are out of healing supplies and you're also low on health, which can happen in this game. At that point, you're essentially stuck there, especially when there is no way back into the previous levels. So you better make sure to always gather your crafting materials, because if you don't do that, you might end up, well, in the worst case scenario, you might end up restarting from an older save spot or restarting the game entirely. If you could softlock yourself into a situation where you're low on health and now you need to beat a boss. That, I think, is a balancing issue that should probably be addressed at some point in the game. I have nothing against the crafting system in general, but maybe dying and respawning should at least give you full HP and mana. That's one idea. But then again, maybe they find a different solution to make this work out with the crafting system. Certain areas areas of the game are interactable. That means you can kind of deliberately break down scaffolding where enemies are standing on, and then the enemies fall off and that does damage to them. So there is a little bit of interactability in the environment in this game. And in situation where you're dealing with projectiles, unfortunately, the block is not useful. As you might expect, your knight, or I mean, he looks more like a barbarian. Your barbarian looking dude, he cannot just parry a fucking arrow with his sword. So obviously, if you are faced with archers and they are a little bit problematic in this game, you need to dodge. And the dodge feels A, a little bit too fast for how massive your character seems to be, and B, due to it not having any kind of iframes on it, you dodging arrows, because that's kind of the only thing you can do against archers, feels a little bit cheap. Either you have to put something in between them so they can't hit you, or you need to really quite directly gauge when and how that arrow is going to hit you. So fighting enemies that are at range, and since the archers in this game are also mostly unaffected by the kinetic magic that you use, and if you're not built into magic, then you're kind of shit out of luck. You need to close the distance, you need to dodge the projectiles, and you need to kill the archer. Even some of the archers are even so dedicated to killing you. If you wield a weapon that doesn't outright stagger them, you will hit them and they'll just queue up a next arrow. So ranged enemies, usually ranged enemies in these games are a little bit problematic, but in this game they feel a little bit unbalanced, because besides magic, there isn't anything you can do against them at range, because they seem to be immune against the kinetic magic. And the push ability obviously has limited range. There's also a specific section in the game that highlights some of the limits of the weapon system. There is a torch section, for lack of a better term, in the game where you are in complete darkness, and that is actually a quite cool idea in theory, because you have very limited vision and you kind of need to navigate a bit of a maze down there. It's not that difficult to find your way. The problem though is, when you wield a torch, you cannot wield any other weapon, because there isn't like a dual wielding property in the game yet. So that means there are 0 enemies down there, and it's just kind of an aesthetically pleasing section in the game. There aren't any real puzzles down there either. It's basically just a walking section. I think it would be kind of cool if you could wield a torch and a one-handed smaller weapon in addition, so that maybe enemies could be down there and you could possibly have some, you know, a little bit more scary enemies in the dark. Maybe in some of the dungeons, if there ever some sort of dungeon in the game. But yeah, I think this was a cool idea. But it's also a little bit of wasted potential, because there are no enemies in that section. Again, very early access game. Maybe they find some sort of way to give you a dual wield option. It's also a little bit unfortunate that you can't go to an open fire and just light a torch and have the torch with you at all points. This seems like the torch is only a specific item for that specific section of the game, and then it's never used again. I think that is also a little bit of a missed opportunity. Now, your progression in this game is very straight. There are singular rooms off the beaten path where you can get some very basic secrets, and there's some locked doors you can open with your magic. In addition, there are some very interesting looking climbing and parkour sections in this game, as I already talked about, but that's about it for additional optional content. Also, for wearing full armor, your character is quite agile, and you will end up jumping off some very precarious heights, and that seems to not bother your player character at all. Especially in the beginning, where you are met with a locked door, and then your first option is to basically jump down into a ravine where some enemies are. There's literally no indication where you should be going besides jumping off of that ledge, which usually in these games there's some sort of fall damage, but apparently there isn't in this one. And again, you're playing this gigantic barbarian looking dude with full plate armor, or I guess it's some sort of berserker armor. I don't know if that guy would feel all too well after jumping some of the heights that he's doing, but okay, there seems to be no discernible amount of falling damage in this game. There isn't any kind of character creator at this point. There isn't any kind of meaningful character cosmetics at any point in time. I think I found like 2 helmets in the game. There isn't any kind of armor. There doesn't seem to be a specific slot for armor sets as well. You only have like your armor and then a helmet. That's about it. Maybe there is some sort of additional systems planned here in this game. This seems to be a very, very early version of what could be like an armor equipment system. You have ring slots. The rings in the game that are present currently, there seems to be multiple copies of them, because I've got multiple rings that just give me a little bit more HP. Again, there's probably placeholder items there. It's a very, very early version of the game. There are some interesting weapons, not a lot of them, but the game does hand out weapons that actually have innate elemental effects. You do get a fire weapon, you do get a poison weapon, and you get an axe that literally just has lifesteal on it. And that made it immediately one of the best weapons in the game, because just having 12% lifesteal on your basic attacks is pretty fucking strong. Now, you only get that weapon at the very, very end of the game, but still, that is maybe a little bit unbalanced, that lifesteal aspect. You can give yourself lifesteal through an elixir and a tonic. That is okay, because that is a buff that's timed. But just having lifesteal on a weapon, maybe not the best idea in terms of balancing. And I guess now we can look at the skill tree and look at the size of that thing. Now, for a game that's only currently 2 hours, that skill tree looks like a tree that belongs into a game that's like 12 hours plus. And even then, there's like so much stuff. Like, this skill tree is almost a little bit oversized. I don't know what the developer was thinking here. There's definitely a little bit too much there, unless the game is going to be much longer or you get much more XP than I initially expected. But yeah, you have defenses, alchemy, magic, and then your basic offensive stats that you can level. Very important, this skill tree works a little bit differently than generic skill trees. As you can see, a lot of these nodes are connected, and you are essentially locked into a specific choice until you reach sort of a crossroads area where you then can branch out into different trees. So that means if you accidentally chose, let's say, the alchemy tree, you are probably going to be locked into upgrading that alchemy branch for the rest of the game. I don't know if that was such a good idea for like the early access version of the game to have such a restrictive skill tree, but then again, you know, it's 2 hours of gameplay, so there isn't that much there. The skill tree is way too oversized for what's currently present in the game. And also some of the stats there are a little bit, you know, you get 2% more attack speed and 2% more attack damage. That's not all too great. I guess these are just kind of generic nodes that are available. You could downsize some of the skill tree, very obviously. I gotta say though, I didn't unlock any of the specialty abilities where you get like a bleed when you crit, for example, or you do have a bleed chance or normal hits. I didn't get to unlock this. And those are really the only interesting upgrades that are present on the skill tree. Most of the other stuff is just kind of percentage-based increases. And I didn't really get to look at the magic and the alchemy trees. These are probably similar, as in they give you more effective tonics and more effective spells, very likely. I think the skill tree needs a little bit of rethinking depending on how long the game actually supposedly turns out to be when it's finished. If the game is short, then having that skill tree present in the game on final release is not a good idea. Unless the game somehow gets an insane amount of replayability, which currently that's a bit of a problem. The game doesn't have that big of a replayability unless you want to try out different skill trees. That's the only reason you would replay the game. And now I think we can talk about the 2 bosses that are present in the game. And that is an aspect where the game falls short in my opinion, because the bosses are not very fun, they're not very well thought out, they're not balanced, and they're not very interesting. One guy is just a big brute, and he also happens to get 4 supporting dudes with him for no reason. The other one is supposedly a more important guy, a big hammer-wielding knight who is alone and who literally puts up no challenge at all. So the one guy that would have maybe needed a few minions is the second boss, not the first boss. The first boss does very well without minions. Now, the difficulty of the first boss kind of comes from it being in a situation where you are not allowed to backtrack, so you might end up in the aforementioned softlock event where you cannot go back anymore and you might not have enough healing to beat the boss. And secondly, he just has some very weird animation tells and hitboxes, very questionable hitboxes on his charge, for example, and he's just placed with 4 enemies in a small room. That's kind of the hallmark of bad boss design. That kind of tells me that the developers are struggling a little bit with enemy balancing. It's something that you will realize when there's more enemies on the screen at once. There isn't any kind of discernible balancing of enemy composition, how they might attack you, how if this is a fair enemy setup or not. It's just kind of put a bunch of enemies in this area and they will come at you all at once if they get the chance. But yeah, there's 2 bosses in the game. One is very annoying and very tough to beat in certain situations, unless you really put your mind to it. And then the second boss is kind of I beat that guy first try without really knowing what I was doing. That guy doesn't do anything interesting. He's way too slow. He doesn't seem to have anything else besides basic hammer swings, and that's it. The enemies in this game are okay. There's a little bit of variety. We have what looks to be like goblins or orcs. I'm not saying the enemy design is particularly impressive, but there's different types of enemies at least. Their design, I don't know, they might come from an asset store, there might be original creations, I don't really know. But there's archers, there are these smaller type enemies that either throw shit at you or they wield spears. That seems to be the main kind of grunt enemy type, and that's definitely a decision to have all of the basic grunt enemies in the game wield spears, and the spears are very effective weapons. So these guys are a pain in the ass to deal with if there's more than 2 of them, because they have a lot of range, way more range than you would expect. And then you have, you know, the shield hugging guy, the archer guy, and the sword wielding guy. Those seem to be different races, or they're just more bigger dudes of the same race, I guess. And that's most of the enemies that are in the game. Again, a very short, very early version. The balancing of these enemies in general they're on their own not very difficult or dangerous to deal with, but the game has certain areas where you're just kind of flooded with enemies, and then when you're so overwhelmed with the limited stamina that you have, then it gets needlessly complicated. And that's also why the health stealing, life stealing axe is so useful, because that kind of circumvents most of the balancing issues in this game, and that shows you that it's a little bit of a problem if you can kind of just waltz through most of the challenges because you have a lifesteal weapon. But most of the frustration in this game comes from some of the input problems and the questionable hitboxes that should maybe get looked at. Essentially, what I'm saying is, it does kind of make sense why this game only costs $8. You will kind of get the quality and the content that you would expect for $8. It's essentially more of a demo for hopefully more to come and hopefully a little bit more balancing. I wonder if the final game will keep its price, or if the final game is even going to happen. It feels like this is a very early concept project of kind of trying to see if it works. Generally, I have nothing against the idea of having a very slow and deliberate Vermintide-inspired game like this, like a fantasy first-person, story-driven action game, but it needs a little bit more polish. Now, if you're wondering about the story and maybe like the music or the art style, well, the art style is kind of just fantasy mixed with Unreal Engine realism. The story is, on the one hand, very much in the back. There's basically not much being said about the world or what you're really doing. You're some sort of apprentice to a druid or at some sort of druid race. But the game also has very, very long and narrated loading screens, which, unless you deliberately keep sitting on the loading screen, you will not even hear the full story. So unless your PC is very slow at loading the levels, you will not even really be hearing most of the lore. It's, I guess, an explanation of the area that you're venturing into. There's a little bit of expositionary dialogue during loading screens, which is not that bad, but maybe it should be text rather than a full narration, because I expect that not a lot of people will be sitting on the loading screen waiting for the narration to finish. And music-wise, there isn't much. Some basic sounds, that's about it. Again, as an early access demo for a game, this is serviceable. Should you buy it now? Well, currently it costs you $8. If the game doesn't get any sort of price increase, which I don't think it will, then no matter in what state the game is going to be in, it's going to cost $6 to $8. There really is no argument here in terms of price. The only reason you wouldn't buy it now is because the aforementioned bugs, hit detection issues, the lack of polish in the game, and then maybe the camera issues and the motion sickness. But besides that, you can probably buy this game right now and just wait and see what's happening with the update pipeline, what the dev is doing with the game. I, for one, am eager to see where the game is going. For now, that's all the game has to offer. I can recommend it if you can stand the motion sickness, and if not, just wait until the game is in a more polished state. And that's it for me. See you next time.